Welcome to the Veritas podcast, the show where we study and discuss papal writings of the Catholic Church.
I'm Robert and he's Rob, and this is the Veritas podcast. In the previous episode where we discussed Libertas, we discussed paragraphs 13 and some of paragraph 15. We discussed the moral obligation to follow the good law and the authority behind it, and the obligation to resist bad laws and that are not in conformity with God's laws. You're also not obligated to follow bad authority or authority that's not established by God or who's going against God's laws. The idea of obedience was also discussed, and the idea that it's a moral virtue. Rob laid out two specific ways that you can sin against this idea of obedience. Number one, in excess, that's obeying a command that you should not obey. And in defect, that's not obeying something that you should obey. We also attempted to cover the concepts of naturalism, rationalism, and liberalism, which are the fundamental errors of the modern day. Naturalism, real briefly, is the system that negates the supernatural order in our lives. Either God doesn't exist, or if he does exist, he does interfere with our day-to-day lives. Rationalism is the application of naturalism to human reason, which then becomes the final authority. If God doesn't exist or does interfere, then our rational minds are God. Therefore, all the miracles and teaching of Jesus are explained as coincidences and superstitions. Finally, liberalism, we talked about, is the application of naturalism to the human will. This means we don't have to obey God's laws, and we can behave whichever way we want, which are all the vices that we see today. So now in Libertas Part 5, what we're talking about, we're going to jump back into paragraph 15, where Pope Leo says, quote, "Hence, these followers of liberalism deny the existence of any divine authority to which obedience is due, and proclaim that every man is the law to himself, from which arises that ethical system which they style independent morality, and which, under the guise of liberty, exonerates man from any obedience to the commands of God and substitutes a boundless license." Rob, what do you think of that?
Right. You see, when God and his law are removed from the picture, like naturalism does, it denies that God intervenes in any way in the affairs of man. When God is removed from the picture, morality becomes purely subjective, okay? Morality is what I think is good personally. So each man's private morality is then based on his own reason and his own will, instead of being based on God's eternal reason and God's will, you see? So God's removed from the picture. There's no more divine revelation. That's rationalism. And then liberalism said, I don't have to obey God's law because I don't think there is a revealed law of God. So then everything becomes based on the will of man. Okay, so every morality is placed on the level of like just a personal opinion. So one person likes a blue car, another person likes a red car. It's just an opinion. But then morality is placed on the same level. So one person thinks fornication's bad, one person thinks it's good. So everything is just on the same level of personal opinion. Okay, and then what happens is this same fundamental error is applied to society as a whole, okay? So if each individual person's morality, okay, is just a private opinion that's based on their own reason and their will, then what is going to happen with public morality? It's the same principle then applied to public morality, which is that public morality is based on the general will. So individual morality is based on the individual will of each man, okay? And then public morality is based on the general will of the population, or, as it's called today, the will of the people. And that's where that comes from, the will of the people, because everything is based on the will and the reason of man. So morality, good and evil, is no longer based on an objective rule. It's not based on the will of God. It's based on the will of man. So if you see what liberalism does. Rationalism, you can say that rationalism is to the speculative order what liberalism is to the practical order. So rationalism is to the speculative order, that's the order of truth. What liberalism then is to the practical order, the order of behavior. So the effect then of liberalism is that the individual reason of the private person, the individual person, and the collective reason of society are considered sovereign, you see. They're considered sovereign, and therefore they're liberated from the obedience due to the eternal reason of God. So liberalism effectively denies God's sovereignty over man, over his rational creation. And what does it end up doing? It ends up doing the exact same thing that Lucifer did when he fell. He said to God, non serviam, I will not serve. And that's the same thing that liberalism says to God, non serviam, I will not serve. But then it goes even further. Because what happens is when the general collective will, the will of the people, becomes the foundation or the source of law, okay, what happens next is that the individuals in that society are required to conform or to accept the will of the people, you see? So regardless of how far the will of the people deviates from the will of God, the individual is then required to accept that. So everything's based on the will of the people, regardless, again, of how far the people have deviated from the will of God. And Rousseau said, whoever refused to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body. So it's what I just said. The individuals are required to conform to the general will, again, regardless of how far that general will has deviated from the divine will.
Leo continues in paragraph 15, quote, the end of all this, it is not difficult to foresee, especially when society is in question. For when once man is firmly persuaded that he is subject to no one, it follows that the efficient cause of the unity of civil society is not to be sought in any principle external to man or superior to him, but simply in the free will of individuals, that the authority in the state comes from the people only. End of quote.
Right. See, it's what we just said. When God's revealed laws rejected, okay, rationalism, and then when man's duty to obey God's law is denied, liberalism, man will consider himself to be the sole source of law and the source of authority. Again, it's the collective will. Authority comes from the collective will. So authority then is based on numbers. And that was, by the way, explicitly condemned in the syllabus of Pius IX, one of the first 5 or 6. He explicitly condemns that. So if 51% of the people want abortion or gay marriage, then that becomes the law of the land. See, that's one of the false principles one of the principles of the false notion of democracy, which is that the collective will of man is supreme, you see? So basically, in effect, this error puts man in the place of God.
And that's pretty much what you say, Rob. The logical conclusion, once you go down the road of naturalism, rationalism, and then eventually liberalism, that really eventually, if God doesn't exist, or if he does, he doesn't have any place to interfere with our lives, then you're really de facto making yourself God in all your decision making.
Exactly. See, the will of God is replaced by the will of man. The sovereignty of God is replaced by the sovereignty of man. And the so-called rights of man then replace the rights of God. It's interesting, Leo XIII, in another encyclical, I believe it was Temezi, he was a clear-thinking pope who saw through all these errors. And he said in that encyclical, he said, about the rights of man, as they are called, the multitude have heard enough. It's time they should hear about the rights of God.
Right. Yeah. That's a good one. Absolutely. All right, he continues, this is Pope Leo quote, and that just as every man's individual reason is his only rule of life, so the collective reason of the community should be the supreme guide in the management of all public affairs. Hence the doctrine of supremacy of the greater number, and that all right and all duty reside in the majority. End of quote.
Right. Yes, what we just said. When God's will, his revealed law and his will are removed from the picture, the will of man is supreme. So right and wrong then, they're based not on an objective rule or objective measure. They're just based on the will of man, the ever-changing and easily manipulated will of man. See, the will of man can be easily manipulated as we see today with people embracing some vices that are contrary to nature itself. So man can easily, his reason can easily be manipulated. And then what happens is man, at least man collectively, the collective will of man takes the place of God. And that is actually the teaching that's behind, now the errors we're discussing, naturalism, rationalism, and liberalism, these are the foundational errors of Masonry, Freemasonry, which are condemned in the encyclical Humanum Janus of Leo XIII. These are all the same errors, but there's also a hidden teaching behind Masonry that Father Fahey exposes very clearly in his book, The Mystical Body of Christ in the Modern World, which is a great book, and it is that man is God. That's actually the hidden teaching behind Masonry, that man is God, which you can see how the teachings that we've been discussing, they flow logically from that belief, because man is put in the place of God. Man's reason, like we said, is the sole principle of truth. So God's out of the picture, man's reason is supreme, and then man's will replaces the will of God. So you see how these teachings, they flow logically from the hidden teaching, which is that, again, man is God. And we see this same teaching now in the New Age movement, who explicitly say that man is God. And there's a new Christian heresy, or there's several of them out there, that also claim that man is God. And my uncle actually got involved in one of these a few years ago for a short time. And so I kind of looked into one of their websites to see what they teach. And I had a little back and forth discussion with them. But what they teach, the way they justify or they explain that man is God, is they say that Christ is just the name of the Spirit. Okay, so Jesus, he was Christ. He had the Spirit of God. So Christ is a name for the Spirit of God. Okay, Jesus had that Spirit, but so does everybody else. You see, so we all have the Spirit of Christ. So we're all God. And that's basically how they arrive at that teaching. They also deny original sin, a lot of other errors in that new sect. I wish I could think of the name of it, but it basically says the same thing that Masonry teaches and that the New Age teaches, which is that man is God.
Yeah, those sorts of sects get all backwards and confused and upside down, almost like, you're in a big tidal wave in the ocean. You can't even tell which way is up and down, because once you take the entire foundation, like we've been talking about this entire series, and you flip that foundation upside down, then there's really no other way to tell which way to go. And so if God either doesn't exist, or he does exist but has nothing to do with anything that happens, especially on Earth, then what else is the point? And so you have to have some sort of authority to make yourself that, and then everything just kind of collapses from there, and they have all sorts of weird and funky beliefs.
Exactly.
So, well, let's
see what happens when man rejects God's revealed teachings and tries to figure it out himself. He ends up in all kinds of strange errors.
And a lot of people don't understand this, but it really does make life harder for them when it makes life hard on me when I don't follow God's teachings and rules. And we keep going back to this liberty, libertas. People want to be free, and they try to free themselves by really enslaving themselves by not following, the God-given principles that are, in our own hearts, and then also His revealed truth. So,
yeah,
it's
exactly
really
right. So you see how we talked about men becoming enslaved to sin, but we haven't got too far into this yet. I plan to discuss this a little bit later on, but man also gets enslaved in error, you see? So he rejects God's truth, and he gets enslaved in error. So not only is there a moral law of God that we must accept, there's also revealed truths that we have to accept. And we'll get into that a little later on in the encyclical. We'll get into a little further into what faith is. There's a lot of confusion today over faith. We'll hopefully discuss what faith is, the act of faith, the virtue of faith, the object of faith, how the faith is lost. We'll get into that in a little more detail. But see, when the faith is lost, then his reason will do just what we've discussed. It'll veer off into all kinds of errors.
Yep, let's go on and get back. Let's finish paragraph 15. Leo continues, quote, "But from what has been said, it is clear that all of this is in contradiction to reason. To refuse any bond of union between man and civil society on the one hand, and God the Creator and consequently the supreme lawgiver on the other, is plainly repugnant to the nature, not only of man, but of all created things. For, of necessity, all effects must in some proper way be connected with their cause, and it belongs to the perfection of every nature to contain itself within that sphere and grade which the order of nature has assigned to it, namely that the lower should be subject and obedient to the higher." End of quote.
Yeah, see, it's contrary to reason not to believe this, but like we've said, when the reason has been corrupted by bad information, like we mentioned, I think it was in episode 1, and then when it's been perverted, when the reason's been perverted by conforming itself to vice, to the blind desires of the will, like we mentioned last episode, then the reason itself it no longer functions as it ought. And we can see this today. For example, you'd be surprised how many people today will deny the principle of non-contradiction, which is it's a self-evident principle of reason, which is that a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same sense. It's a self-evident principle of reason, but today people, I would say the majority of people, deny this. I heard a philosophy professor recently say that he said the majority of his students deny this principle, and again, that's just evidence of the corruption of human reason at this time. So Leo 13 says this is in contradiction to reason, but unfortunately, reason of man today is corrupted, so he can't spot it. He can't see the contradiction, just like he can't see the error in saying that a thing can both be and not be at the same time in the same sense. Obviously, that's obviously an error, but people today can't see it.
Let's continue. Pope Leo in Libertas number 16 says, quote, "Moreover, besides this, a doctrine of such character is most hurtful both to individuals and to the state. For once ascribed to human reason the only authority to decide what is true and what is good, and the real distinction between good and evil is destroyed, honor and dishonor differ not in their nature, but in the opinion and judgment of each one. Pleasure is the measure of what is lawful, and given a code of morality which can have little or no power to restrain or quiet the unruly propensities of man, a way is naturally opened to universal corruption. With reference also to public affairs, authority is severed from the true and natural principle, whence it derives all of its efficacy for the common good, and the law determining what is right to do and avoid doing is at the mercy of a majority. End of quote. As we've said before, Rob, without morality, true law can't exist. Naturalists want to decide what is best without God as a reference. So if God is to be separated from the state, then the only authority is the will of the people, the majority, which we've been talking about. I got a question, Rob. Can you explain what the Holy Father means when he writes, quote, pleasure is the measure of what is lawful?
Yeah, it gets back to what we discussed. I think it was in the last episode, or it might have been in episode 3. When good and evil, truth and error are considered a matter of personal opinion, okay, which is what happens when the law puts good and error, truth or good and evil, truth and error on the same level. When that happens, the distinction between the two it's blurred, okay? And then eventually the reason becomes confused, okay? And it can no longer then distinguish the true good from evil, all right? Which is exactly what we're seeing today. Remember, the reason is supposed to be what judges the true good so that it can then direct the will, remember, in its choice. We discussed that in the first few episodes. But when the reason is confused and when it allows the will to choose according to the blind desires, like we talked about in the past, okay, the reason then, it starts to conform itself to the blind, unthinking desires, all right? And when that happens, the person then becomes enslaved to their vices. And the reason begins then to justify why these actions, which are contrary to the natural law that it has, it justifies why these actions are okay, all right? And then the reason it conforms itself to the blind desires and begins to follow the blind desires, like we said in the last episode or a few episodes ago. It's the blind following the blind. It's the reason which has blinded itself, okay? It follows the blind desires for pleasure, okay? And then pleasure becomes the rule. It becomes the law. You see? The reason, which is supposed to direct the will, instead it follows the blind will, and then pleasure, which is what the desires tend towards, the blind pleasures, the pleasure becomes the rule of law. So I think that's what he's getting at there. And then when man rejects God's law, okay, and conforms his reason to his will, there's nothing then to stop human law itself from being brought into line with man's blind desires. You see, when you think that the will of man is supreme, okay, and then when the reason of man becomes corrupt and confused and conforms itself to the disordered inclinations of the will, when that happens and when the will of man is said to be supreme, what's going to happen is the laws of society are themselves going to be conformed to the disordered inclinations of man. And that's what we're seeing today with things like gay marriage and other things, where laws are being conformed to the disordered movements of man's lower nature, irrespective of his right reason and irrespective of God's law.
Yeah, right no longer is right based on a majority or whatever people think, for sure. Pope Leo continues in Libertas, paragraph 16, quote, "Now this is simply a road leading straight to tyranny. The empire of God over man and civilized society once repudiate, it follows that religion as a public institution can have no claim to exist, and that everything that belongs to religion will be treated with complete indifference." End of quote. This idea of relegating religion to the margins is given pretty good treatment in Pius's excellent Pascendi. It can be claimed that the naturalists are being hypocritical. On the one hand, they don't want any absolutes because the mind is the authority, but on the other hand, they don't want to tolerate the idea that there is an absolute and that religion is the instrument of that truth. Rob, what do you think?
That's exactly right. One of the characteristics of liberals is excessive tolerance and even approval for sin and error, and then at the same time, they have an intolerance of objective truth, just like you were saying. And it's interesting that you brought up the encyclical Pascendi, because modernism, which is a heresy that was condemned in that encyclical, modernism is, you could call it the religious offspring of the other errors that we've been discussing. And it's interesting to see how the heresy of modernism flows logically from naturalism and rationalism. Remember what we said about naturalism? It denies any intervention of God in the temporal order, including divine revelation. And then rationalism claims that human reason alone is the source of truth. Well, modernism then, flowing from these errors, modernism is like the religious offspring of these. It claims that religion itself comes from within man, you see. So rationalism says reason is the only source of truth. So what does modernism say? It says religion itself comes from within man. They say it comes from a divine principle that's part of man's nature. You see, religion doesn't come from God through public revelation, through external revelation, but from a divine principle within each man. And so then they would maintain that all the different religions in the world, the Hindu, Buddhism, they're all just different variations. They're just different manifestations of the divine within. So for a modernist, there's not one true revealed religion, you see. For them, all the different religions are true to a degree because they all come from the same divine source, which they say is within each man. You see how that works? And then, so where does a modernist go in his search for the truth? He goes to man. A modernist searches for truth by dialoguing with false religions, which is exactly what we see today.
Leo continues as he ends the Libertas, paragraph 16, quote, "Furthermore, with ambitious designs on sovereignty, tumult and sedition will be common amongst the people, and when duty and conscience cease to appeal to them, there will be nothing to hold them back but force, which of itself alone is powerless to keep their covetousness in check. Of this we have almost daily evidence in the conflict with socialists and members of other seditious societies, who labor unceasingly to bring about revolution. It is for those, then, who are capable of forming a just estimate of things to decide whether such doctrines promote that true liberty which alone is worthy of man, rather pervert and destroy it." End of quote. That'll do it for this episode of the Veritas podcast. Join us next time as we continue our discussion on Pope Leo's Libertas.